The child nobody could identify for 65 years. In February of 1957, a man walking along a quiet road in Philadelphia made a discovery that would become one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. Inside a discarded cardboard box was the body of a young boy. No identification, no missing person report, no one claiming him. Just a child left behind as if he had never existed at all. Imagine this for a moment. A child is found with no name, no history, no one searching for him. How is that even possible? The boy in the box, as he would later be known, was estimated to be around 4 to 6 years old. He was found in a wooded area, wrapped in a blanket, placed inside a cardboard box that had once contained a baby bassinet. The location wasn't remote enough to hide something forever, but it was quiet enough to delay discovery. From the very beginning, something about the case felt deeply unsettling, not just because of what had happened, but because of what was missing. No one had reported a child like him missing. No family came forward, no school records, no neighbors, nothing. Now think about this. If a child disappears today, it spreads instantly. Alerts, news, social media. But even in 1957, how does a child vanish without anyone noticing? Police began their investigation immediately. They examined the area, collected evidence, took photographs. But the problem wasn't just solving the crime, it was identifying the victim. Because without a name, there was no starting point. Investigators released images. They shared details with the public. They asked for help. And the response was overwhelming. Thousands of tips came in. People believed they recognized the boy. Some thought he looked like a neighbor. Others thought he resembled a missing relative. But none of those leads led to a confirmed identity. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still, no one came forward to claim him. At this point, ask yourself something. What kind of situation would have to exist for a child to be completely unaccounted for? As investigators looked deeper, they noticed details about the boy that raised even more questions. His hair had been recently cut. There were signs that he had been bathed. His body showed signs of malnourishment. These weren't random details. They suggested a story of a child who had been somewhere, with someone, before he was left in that box. But who? And why had no one ever reported him missing? One of the first major leads came from the box itself. It was traced back to a specific type of bassinet sold in local stores. Investigators hoped that someone might remember purchasing it, but that trail went cold. Then came another clue: the blanket the boy was wrapped in. It was identified as a type commonly produced in the region, but again, no clear link to a specific person. The case continued to grow, not in clarity, in complexity, because every new detail raised more questions than answers. And slowly the case began to change, from an active investigation into a mystery that refused to be solved. But there was one theory, one account that would later draw significant attention. A woman would come forward years later, claiming she knew who the boy was and what had happened to him. We'll come back to her story, because if it's true, it changes everything. But before that, there's something else you need to consider. Because sometimes the most important clue in a case isn't what is found, it's what's missing. In the months following the discovery of the boy in the box, investigators continued to search for something, anything that could give the child a name, because without that, the case couldn't truly move forward. They revisited the scene, the box, the blanket. Every small detail was examined again and again, and one thing became clear. Whoever left the boy there
had taken steps to make identification difficult. There were no personal belongings, no clothing that could be traced easily, no items linking him to a home, a school, or a family. Now think about this. If someone wanted to hide a crime, would removing identity be the first step? Or does it suggest something even darker? Police began expanding their search. They contacted schools, hospitals, adoption agencies, orphanages. They checked missing children reports not just in Philadelphia, but across the country. Still, nothing. It was as if the boy had lived his entire life outside the system. That idea alone raised troubling questions, because for a child to remain completely undocumented, he had to be hidden. And if he was hidden, then someone knew about him. Years passed. The case didn't disappear, but it slowed. Occasionally, new leads would surface, a tip, a sighting, a theory, but none of them could be confirmed. Then, decades later, a woman came forward with a story. She claimed that as a child, she had lived in a home where a boy was kept hidden. She described him as small, quiet, and often mistreated. According to her account, the boy had been brought into the home under unclear circumstances. He wasn't treated like a family member, more like someone who wasn't supposed to be seen. She said he was abused, neglected, and kept isolated. Then, one day, something went wrong. She claimed the boy had been fatally injured during an incident involving punishment. After that, his body was placed in a box and abandoned. The details she provided matched certain aspects of the case: the age, the condition, the lack of identification. But there was a problem. Her story couldn't be fully verified. Investigators looked into her claims. They searched for evidence, tried to connect her account to known facts, but there were gaps, missing pieces, no definitive proof linking her story to the boy. Now think about this. If someone gives a detailed account years later, how do you decide if it's truth or a story shaped by memory? Because memory changes over time. Details blur. Events can feel real even when they aren't. Still, her story remained one of the most discussed theories in the case, because it offered something the investigation had lacked for years: a possible explanation. But even that explanation was uncertain. As time went on, the case became one of the most well-known cold cases in the United States. The boy remained unidentified. Investigators continued trying new methods, new technologies, new approaches. Because even decades later, one question remained at the center of everything: who was he? And somewhere in that answer was the truth about what happened to him. We'll come back to the efforts to identify the boy, because they would eventually take a modern turn. A turn involving technology that didn't exist in 1957. And that shift would bring the case closer to an answer than it had ever been before. But before that, there's something else to consider. Because in cases like this, the hardest part isn't always solving the crime. It's restoring identity. For decades, the case of the boy in the box remained suspended in uncertainty. Investigators had exhausted traditional methods. Witnesses faded, memories blurred, leads went cold. But the case was never truly closed, because even as years passed, there was always one goal that remained unchanged: give the boy a name. And as technology advanced, that possibility slowly became more real. Forensic science began to evolve. DNA testing improved. Databases expanded. Methods that didn't exist in 1957 were now capable of answering questions that once seemed impossible. Investigators revisited the evidence, preserved samples, anything that could still be tested. And this time, they weren't just looking for a suspect.
They were looking for identity. Because identifying the boy would unlock everything else. Now think about this. If you don't know who the victim is, how do you ever truly solve the crime? Years turned into decades, and then, finally, there was a breakthrough. Using advanced DNA analysis and genealogical research, investigators were able to trace family connections, not directly, but through distant relatives. By building a genetic family tree, they began narrowing down possibilities, line by line, generation by generation, until eventually, the boy who had no name was identified. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. For the first time in over 65 years, he was no longer just the boy in the box. He had an identity, a history, a place in the world. But even with that discovery, the case wasn't fully solved, because knowing who he was didn't fully explain what happened to him. Investigators began looking into his background, his family connections, the circumstances of his life, trying to understand how a child could exist and yet remain invisible. Now think about this. How does a child go unnoticed for so long? What kind of environment allows that to happen? Because this case isn't just about a crime, it's about absence. The absence of records, the absence of witnesses, the absence of someone saying, "I know him." And maybe that's what makes this case so different. Not just the mystery of what happened, but the silence that surrounded it. Even today, there is no confirmed account of Joseph's final days, no single version of events that explains everything, only fragments, possibilities, and theories that don't fully connect. And that leaves us with something difficult, a story that is partially resolved but not complete. Because while we now know his name, we still don't fully know his life or the person responsible for ending it. So now let me ask you something. If a case like this can remain unsolved for decades, even with modern technology, what does that say about how many other stories might still be out there? Stories without answers, without closure, without justice. And one more thing to think about. Now that we finally know his name, do you think this case will ever truly be solved? Or will it remain one of those rare mysteries where the truth is always just out of reach? Because in the end, this case leaves us with something more than just facts. It leaves us with a responsibility to remember, not just the mystery, but the person at the center of it. Joseph Augustus Zarelli, a child who was unknown for decades, but is now finally known. Thank you for listening.